I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine channel. Today we continue with the Psychic Bible, the Apocryphal Scriptures of Genesis P-Orridge, and the Third Mind of the Temple of Psychic Youth, Section 121. Part B of Part 13. The Process is the Product. The process is the product. Since the mid-60s, my teenage years, I have always been profoundly obsessed with human behavior. Whether there can be a system, technique, chemical, belief system, discipline that is able to reprogram entrenched inherited patterns of behavior. Is there any way to short-circuit control, erase compulsive and reactive responses? Can we reinvent a self consciously in order to maximize its potential and hopefully, therefore, our satisfaction in life? My lifelong search is for focused mutability, and to change the means of perception, to challenge every status quo as a matter of principle and never rest, never assume or imagine that the task of reinvention has a finite ending. Permanent change towards a radical, positive, and liberating evolutionary mutation of the human species is the core essence and motivation of every single aspect of my creativity. Parallel to this aesthetic and philosophical accession has been a strange, synchronous, concurrent, and almost symbiotic series of similarities of problems and media issues at critical intersections in our gradual progress through the various projects that feel as if they're delivered like an advisory commentary by the story of the Process Church The Final Judgment. The process has so much reflectivity in my own life journey that it has come to be valued as a manual of strategic repair when serious conflicts with control occur. At other times, I use my process archives and documents as a means of problem resolution. This gradual but lifelong adoption of my possibly misconstrued subjective understanding of the process has an almost oracular quality, sometimes implying what we should do and sometimes illustrating what we should not in terms of how to modify the perceptual misconceptions of the overarching established monolithic culture at any given time. In order to contextualize to some extent the ongoing interaction of the process with key moments during my life, a little background is required. The very first mention of the process that we were consciously aware of was in an early issue of Oz magazine, the most psychedelic, tripped-out underground publication of the 60s and 70s. With white print on yellow overlaid with clashing green art nouveau graphics, it was able to generate an internally environment equally as challenging as an actual acid trip. The writers in Oz was trumpeting a somewhat overblown warning to freaks that the process was an insidious mind control cult fraught with oppressive psychotherapeutic technologies and covert monetary greed. Needless to say, as is often the case, the more vivid the descriptions of the group were, the more mysteriously they were defamed, the more obdurate our fascination became. Later we would realize with hindsight that vicious, fallacious articles we had found starkly compelling had been sensationalized investigations into the process. One way that my friends and I financed buying ourselves hash was street-selling Oz and International Times, to two main publications to have grown out of the 60s post-acid counterculture. The other way we raised money was by selling books. We would persuade our parents we were going to London on the train to see a Magritte exhibition at the Tate Gallery, and that we would be staying with a friend's grandparents in Purley, London. Then we'd sneak off by bus to the motorway and hitchhike to London, thus saving our money for food, fun, and live music. If you timed a visit right, you could stay all the night on the foam-cushioned floor of the Arts Lab Cinema in Drury Lane. Daytimes were spent shoplifting books on Tottenham Court Road. We focused on City Lights beat poetry, W.S. Burroughs, Jean Genet, Henry Miller, the Marquis de Sade, and their ilk. Nights were the Arts Lab, UFO Club, and later in squats in Drury Lane and Piccadilly. Our appetite for new ideas, contrary philosophies, drugs, sensualism, and alternative communities and lifestyles was insatiable. We were adolescent dreamers searching for novelty for its own sake and extra-sensualist perception. One weekend, whilst hanging around on the King's Road outside Granny Takes a Trip, a shop selling the ultimate in dandy-flavored flower child clothing at the time, and coveting the riot of silks and velvets, brocades, and multi-ethnic jewelry, we saw a guy in a weird outfit. He had long hair and beard, all of which were de rigueur at the time, but he seemed groomed and was wearing a cloak and dark clothes. My instincts told me he represented an antithesis of the shock of colors and informality of the typical hippie. Part of me wanted to talk to him, but something held me back. Maybe my lack of money, as I could by then tell that he was street-selling a magazine. I got close enough to see it wasn't Oz or IT. It was strikingly colored Process magazine. To this day, it's impossible for me to explain to myself why this minimal event touched me so deeply. But on some subliminal gut level, my intuition compelled me to decide to make a point of trying to discover what I could about this vilified group. What was it about them that unified the disparate and contradictory elements of the counterculture in condemnation and paranoia? By the end of 1969, I had realized that the process were the same group accused of being the mind-menders of Mayfair in the British gutter press, and who were alleged to have programmed the Manson family and later the son of Sam and who knows what else. The process became the symbol of the neo-hippie boogeyman. Anyone able to shatter society's complacency on such a deep level resonated with my own compulsive urge to strip away hypocrisy and bigotry, conditioning and imposed behavioral patterns in order to attempt to create a self-chosen identity, releasing my maximum personal potential so that my life could be an unfolding autonomous narrative written by my self-conscious choices. By 1969, I was living in the exploding galaxy in Islington, London, surrendering my creativity, personality, and my future to an extremely demanding commune. We tried to break down as many inherited values, inhibitions, gender role stereotypes, and imposed social roles by trying to isolate any habitual mannerisms or behavioral assumptions. Later, I founded Coom Transmissions, a performance art group that, during the first half of the 1970s, delved deeper and deeper into character archetypes and social, especially sexual, taboos and limitations. We wanted to create a morally clean slate upon which we and only we then designed and manifested an independently constructed individual identity. As our public explorations became more and more intimate, so media attention became focused upon our work in an ever more antagonistic style, until in October 1976, after the opening of our retrospective Prostitution at the ICA Gallery in London, an unexpectedly huge tsunami of outrage, disgust, and scurrilous defamation drowned all meaning in mannered, contrived enunciations. I thought that scandal occurred when an artist or action of some kind exposed the obsolescence of a particular contemporary and socially endorsed moral convention, a process which could imply that by triggering a neo-moralist media outcry, our intention to reveal outmoded conventions that damage and frustrate an individual's potential, making hope subservient to the hierarchical quote-unquote greater good, would be an end in and of itself. I imagined in a simplistic way that the destruction of a corrupted status quo was an end in itself. The anarchy was always preferable to inertia, but I was miscalculating. When you are suddenly the subject of feature exposés in the yellow press, finding one's ideals ridiculed and twisted to deliberately alienate the public for one's sincere and optimistic intentions, it quickly becomes apparent that what actually happens is your message gets lost in the hysterical noise of slander. After this experience, I remembered the process, experiencing an even more extreme smear campaign. Did what befall them provide a strategy that I could learn from and utilize? It didn't, but it did start me thinking about possible conflicts with the establishment in the future and whether we could prepare ourselves better to avoid the soul-destroying impact that occurs when the governing powers that be, those gray beings with a vested interest in maintaining their privilege and influence, attack you with unrelenting fervor. I knew that the direction my thoughts were taking my life and art were almost certain to release further attempts to censor and silence my ideas. By 1981, I had been privately exploring phenomena that had spontaneously occurred during some of the more extreme, physically taxing, and long time-based art performances. I noticed that I occasionally spoke in tongues, could erase my responses to pain, achieve altered shamanic-type states of consciousness, out-of-body experiences, and time dilation and contraction. These events had been random and uncontrolled, but revelatory. They were also incredibly intimate, so I began a series of controlled rituals in private, utilizing a sacred space, talismanic objections, self-composed ambient music, incense, candles, and sensory deprivation. I had acquired a coffin during recording Dreams Less Sweet, and would sometimes spend several hours wrapped in wolfskins in bondage under the coffin after ingesting a heavy dose of psychedelics, for example. I also began reading up on Western magic, in particular Austin Osman Spare. At the same time, I came across the W.S. Brainbridge book, Satan's Power, based, quote-unquote, on the process, and rekindled my interest in that group much more deeply than before. I felt a certain kinship already, having been victimized by a scurrilous media for my way of life, an attempt to unify that life with art in a liberating and evolutionary synthesis. When I co-founded Psychic TV with Alex Ferguson in 1981, it was with another integrated project in mind. During long winter discussions with my inspirational collaborator Monte Cazaza, We considered what might happen if a rock band, instead of just seeing fans as an income flow and an ego booster, focused that admiration and energy toward a cultural and lifestyle directing network. What would happen if we created a paramilitary occult organization that shared demystified magical techniques? Sleeve notes could become manifestos, a call to action and behavioral rebellion. Bit by bit, we took this daydream more seriously. We examined the process in particular for the best in cult aesthetics. We needed an ideology for those involved, levels to achieve, secrets to reveal, symbols and uniforms, regalia and internal writings. We called our experimental organization the Temple of Psychic Youth. Our previous involvement with mail art gave us grounding in mailing out flyers and newsletters. My researches into ritual and directed orgasm became a central activity that demanded 23 monthly sigils created on the 23rd of each month at 23 hours Greenwich Mean Time. From the process, we saw the need for a logo, a symbol. I designed the Psychick Cross, a vertical line with 3 horizontals. The central line shorter than the other 2. All the lines in the proportion of 2 to 3. One of the secrets of this design, revealed for the first time here, is if you create a grid of psychic crosses in a particular configuration, you will see process symbols in all the spaces in between. If you create a different configuration, you will see swastikas in all the spaces in between. The Psychic Cross is a nonverbal logo that represents the sum total of all the activities, desires, products, and creativity manifested in its name. I wanted to make sure, even in a sense invisibly, that our debt to the process was honored. One of our friends was a great seamstress. We combined gray pre-shirts we bought at Roman Catholic suppliers with combat boots and gray military-style trousers that she produced. Embroidered patches in the vesica, vaginal shape, with a psychic cross and 23, were sewn on jackets and shirts to identify the TOPY community. Finally, we looked again at the process and saw that the long hair and beards, whilst common enough in the 1960s on one person, had a powerful impact once they were collected together en masse. The TOPY haircut was a combination of the long and sensuous in the form of a long tail of hair at the back of the head, and then the rest of the head was shaved in reference to the ascetic spiritual disciplines. Ascetic and decadent, the eternal balance and or contradictions. Definitely, though, having the Psychic Cross was the most instantly effective strategy for generating very quickly the impression of a serious, focused militant network. The Psychic Youth look was so strong that it seduced and attracted males and females to adopt it very quickly. A handful of psychic youth dressed up, in even a large crowd, had an immediate visceral impact far beyond what might be expected from such small numbers. It was particularly the records that spread TOPY abroad. We were soon receiving inquiries from the U.S. and Canada, then France, Germany, Sweden, and on and on. This meant we were very exposed in the media, and primarily to music fans rather than to the already serious seekers of occult knowledge and techniques. This sometimes over-dilettantish segment of our network created a serious credibility issue amongst more established magical fraternities and devotees. We ourselves had been constructing TOPY initially to see what happens when demystified occult and shamanic practices are released non-hierarchically into popular culture. What will be the occult impact of several hundred, rather than several thousand individuals masturbating to a common desire and purpose at exactly the same time all around the world. It had never been done before, so we saw this as a contemporary research into the effectiveness of these techniques. But as we grew in numbers and had to keep improvising new structures and solutions to administer TOPY, we began looking for assistance and advice from outside. My ongoing interest in the process had resulted in my collecting every publication, newspaper file, Freedom of Information folder, and any other memorabilia from rare booksellers in England and the USA. I started reading the Process magazines, of which we had a full set scanned by a friend, and the books excluding Exit, Humanity is the Devil, Satan on War, and even transcripts of LA police interviews with bikers after the Manson murders that a journalist friend from Hell University acquired for me. What became apparent was that to evolve and remain relevant and vibrant, TOPY must become a template for a way of life, that the process, for good or ill, thrived by proposing a fully engaging system of living combined with spiritual and mental exploration. That to expose flaws in behavior and personality and to have any chance of revelatory and revolutionary breakthroughs, the group had to immerse themselves 100% in devotion to the group and fearless surrender to the potential challenges and innovations, even at the risk of personal disintegration and mental collapse. Transformation can only occur if the individual is prepared to sacrifice all they have, including a previous personality and a place in the status quo. Smashing old loops and habitual patterns is essential. TOPY discovered that a certain ratio of individuals were so dissatisfied with their current state of mind, the lack of magic in all senses and of connection to others, of outmoded sexual roles and gender expectations and archetypes, that they were prepared to move into a far more processing approach to the burgeoning community. With our archive of process publications and a probably idiosyncratic interpretation of the messages and structures that had used, we began a migration to Brighton, England. Why Brighton? We wanted a better environment for my daughter's caress in Jeunesse. Plus, Brighton had a history of alternative culture and liberal ideas from the 60s and even earlier. So with my family and two hardcore TOPY individuals, we bought a large Georgian house in Brighton, complete with an extra self-contained apartment. Sister Shadows and Brother Words sold their London home, as we had, to move a few houses down in the same street. We kept the London TOPY station. A station was the main headquarters that administered a whole country or larger territory, overseeing the various more localized access points. In 50 Beck Road, Hackney, where several TOPY individuals lived and worked and where our original nursery was still active. A nursery was a room in a TOPY house exclusively dedicated to magical rituals and sigilization. The TOPY station in London's nursery had a rather gothic Baroque decor that included an old Victorian dentist chair that had seen his dentist owner commit sex crimes on it before he was caught, convicted, and sent to prison. Just as the process flirtation with implied satanic beliefs and other sensationalist mischief ended up biting them so nastily, so TOPY's amusement with the darker aspects of humanity also backfired in a hauntingly similar way. Not long after the TOPY equivalent to the Process Omega moved to Brighton, a steady trickle of fully committed individuals had followed us there. We soon had 5 houses that were all TOPY individuals, plus the London TOPY station. It became clear we needed to keep everyone occupied, and that we had a marvelous resource to experiment together in living and designing a TOPY way of life 24/7. The process really came into its own. We began to have a TOPY communal meal every Monday. The TOPY houses would rotate, taking turns to cook a meal for everyone and then to develop more systems. Just as the process improvised additional structures and disciplines in an ad hoc way, and Mary Ann and Robert would note developments, observations, and concepts during long meetings of the original hardcore members, so we would discuss problems arising from communal living, sexual friction, the purity of group sigils as opposed to lecherous exploitation, and new options for the command structure. In particular, I drew on my experiences living in communes most of my life, first the Exploding Galaxy, then Ho Ho Funhouse, then Coom Transmissions, and now TOPY. One potent and fulfilling exercise was the TOPY life story. Each Monday, one individual would be chosen or would volunteer to tell their life story, the rule being that nothing is left out, no matter how distressing, humiliating, traumatic, or depressing. The whole truth. Usually this was the first time anybody had told his or her real story. The act of trust involved in revealing such vulnerability was immense. We discovered so much about each other this way, and learned why people had certain issues or habits or personality loops and quirks, both positive and negative. Interruptions were not allowed, but questions, no matter how intimate, could be presented afterwards and said to be answered. The first 1 or 2 stories were difficult to present, but once 1 or 2 had narrated their innermost experiences and pains, it became easier and easier for others to participate. It was revealed to us over and over how many boys and girls had suffered sexual abuse, and often combined with violence. This prevailing social ugliness that we had all been damaged by became a bond in its revelation that created intense mutual loyalty amongst the TOPY Brighton contingent. Our compassion for each other deepened and has remained as dedicated and mutual loyalty all these years. TOPY included heterosexual couples with open relationships, monogamous couples both gay and straight, transsexuals, and quite a few couples with children plus single mothers. During the TOPY years especially, we visited other communes, in particular becoming close to the Zendik Farm, a commune cult dating back to Los Angeles in the acid 60s, whose emphasis is on self-sufficiency by organic farming and ecological awareness. We studied the Manson family, the Moonies, the Children of God, Jim Jones, Source, Coquettes, and came to know people at Morningstar Ranch, another 60s holdover in Sonoma County. Many of these communes and cults experimented with separation of children from their biological parents to try and avoid inherited conditioning and emotional dependency. Though I wonder if it wasn't consciously or not a way to try to ensure fealty to the group, and by implication the group guru, leader, figurehead, enlightened super being, thereby assuring new, ever more fanatical followers who would have known no other way of life or belief system. Timothy Wiley confesses that the process's attitude to children was careless and potentially rather mean-spirited, seeing them almost as a hindrance to the spiritual advancement of individual members and a nuisance, and that he sees that as pretty shameful. Fortunately, as I myself had two daughters, Caress and Jeunesse, children did have a place in our ever-evolving way of living. Quite naturally, it seemed, both my children and later several others were adopted instinctively as special individuals in their own right. We created a TOPY naming ceremony for each child and included them in films and on records. The only declared policy was to always talk to them in exactly the same language we would use about an issue or question for an adult. TOPY inadvertently became a large pool of children carers and babysitters, which gave all mothers in particular a lot more time for study and creative activities. Caress and Jeunesse always went on tour with Psychic TV, accompanied by a trained nursery teacher, a nurse from within the TOPI ranks. Their memories of living on the quote-unquote even further 1966 school bus TOPYNA North America, purchased for us to tour the USA and Canada in, and being made a fuss of everywhere, are amongst their fondest, most vivid early memories. In 1988, a new zone was created in TOPY station in Brighton that was named the Collie Circle. This was a female-only group. As often happens in close-knit communities, the collies in TOPY noticed they were all menstruating at the same time, their biological clocks synchronizing their proximity, reinforced by the monthly intimacy of sigilizing. As is commonly the case, the Edens would feel the collies would become moody together, more prone to intolerance of stupidity, nagging, or criticism. Through reading and discussion of women's magical powers and the deeply alchemical resonance of menstrual blood, it was proposed by all genders to experiment with seeing this monthly time as an opportunity to harness all the incredible intensity and potency rather than fight it or feel threatened by shifts in collies' behaviors. The collie circle became autonomous, closed to all biological males and self-defining. To declare the activation through menstruation of the group, TOPY women began wearing a red cotton thread around their left wrist. During their red time, all challenging, strange, or intense behavior was automatically accepted. Collies were left alone to channel their hormonal gifts in creative, conceptual, or physically active pursuits that were beyond questioned. BEYONF. Surprisingly to all, this liberated the biological males to not feel personally criticized or insecure, and liberated the biological females to behave and explore without guilt or restriction, knowing any usual day-to-day responsibilities would be covered during their blessed state of power by other TOPY individuals. TOPY tended to see mutual assistance and support by any means at everyone's disposal as the most efficient methodology as well as the most generous. We posited that by sharing all our skills, properties, and assets voluntarily, we could all live a lifestyle way beyond our personal resources. The TOPY individual in Brighton, for example, could say that rather than having only one room in a shared apartment, if they were alone, they had 5 houses which included gardens and a large jacuzzi, as well as fully equipped offices and music and video recording facilities, plus homes across the USA, Canada, Germany, Holland, and so on. Everyone became a token millionaire simply by choosing to reciprocate sharing. Quite a few ratio for TOPY individuals became nomadic, traveling about the access point network, exchanging labor and other skills for shelter. The most famous, even happily notorious, was Boris of TOPY Pyromania, who continues this now neo-TOPY pilgrimage to this day, an acid trip to gain, who has become the talisman of fortune for Psychic TV and PTV3. He follows PTV3 around on their tours, acting as a roadie, archivist of documentation, and confidant. One thing we always hoped for was that the Psychic Cross would come to be a signal of trustworthiness and succor for those individuals who wore it. We have heard hundreds of tales of people in far-off places, stranded or in dire need, who saw a Psychic Cross tattoo, pin, or won that the clothing on someone who rescued and protected them. That is a wonderful phenomenon. One method we took directly from the process was telepathy raising sessions. Each Monday at the TOPY meals, we would begin with a blessing. This is my cross. This is my life. This is my wisdom. Then we would all hold hands in a circle around the table, or, if there were too many individuals, around the large living room. Everyone would focus inside with eyes closed, even the children present, and after around 10 minutes a book was opened, and each person wrote down any images they saw if they did. We found that as the months went by, there was a clear increase in similarities. One time in particular, almost half of those persons saw some images that included a lion. Trust and bonding went hand in hand. They were even more resilient and lasting among TOPY individuals who participated in communal sigilizing. Each TOPY house had a nursery devoted to generating, maintaining, and amplifying psychic and magical energies. We believed, and were convinced, we were experiencing genuine visions, out-of-body experiences, interdimensional portals, and an ongoing connection to some power or phenomenon that we saw as a positive interrelationship with synchronicity. It seemed apparent to us all that committed repetition of a personally developed magical language instead of talismanic objects could literally force the hand of chance. We were also sure that by using orgasm to, in a sense, post a desire into the deep conscious, bypassing social barriers and filters, the usual laws of probability broke down and one's effective focus was increased, making what you wished to happen more and more likely as you continued using sigils to reinforce your will. Redundant phobias and neuroses were stripped away, inadequacies were evaporated, and emotional baggage and distortion dropped away. The mind began to make day-to-day practical choices that would maximize the attainment of the will desire, reinforced by your being, your various levels of consciousness, resulting in an ever-increasing positive relationship with success in work, play, and relationships. The sexual orgasm as reprogramming was not a new idea, but what TOPY did was discard elitist structures that made a person keep having to pay more for the next level of secrets that only this group were privy to. We did away with obfuscation and deliberate theatricality and mumbo-jumbo, and made public the secret of all ages, the ninth degree of the OTO, and the tantric essence, and we gave it away free, whilst publicly confessing the sex magic was central to our contemporary occult way of life. This was both our selling point and our downfall. The Temple of Psychic Youth was an experimental community and network that took the practice of magical techniques seriously as a means to short-circuit control, as William S. Burroughs once entreated me to make my primary lifelong theme. Just as my time in the exploding galaxy had been a crash course in stripping away bourgeois values and inherited ways of being by using brutal deconditioning techniques in group sessions where one member would be pillared and hounded emotionally for any visual or physical repetitious behavioral patterns. Why is your hair the same as it was yesterday? Why did you sleep in the same place as yesterday? Why do you need money, clothes, knives and forks to write in straight lines, and on until a personality collapsed in ruins, hopefully to be replaced by a constantly regenerating form of creation exploration that took nothing for granted. So Coombe Transmissions had isolated symbolic identity and looked for methods to deconstruct identity and habituated types of individualized character. Coombe had costumes that represented different archetypes. For example, Harriet Straightlaced was a bigoted old lady, disgruntled with everything in modern life, always certain her past was far better than any present, blaming everyone and anyone for whatever annoyed her next. Mr. Alien Brain was an interdimensional visitor who was trying to observe and analyze humanity from an extraterrestrial anthropologist perspective, and was constantly baffled by the self-defeating ways of human beings. He was puzzled by war, violence, greed, religion, sexual guilt, and commerce. TOPY tried to break personal habits and preconceptions, erase all cultural imperatives, in order to generate an autonomous space for the practitioner to individualize their own identity and create their own fully chosen narrative. TOPY grew far more than we had imagined, even though we demanded a rigorous series of sex magical documents charged via orgasmic fluid, blood, saliva, and hair. These sigils began as a method of self-analysis to seek one's true innermost desires and ambitions. But as months went by, they shifted from the more mundane urges for sexual partners and money into far more esoteric goals that dissected behavior, possible origins of life, matter, and consciousness. Most individuals would find themselves working with language and image to create symbolic glyphs and nonverbal systems to map out the nature of time, existence, and perception. This journey we all made together became a communally experienced process and led by myself back to the other original process. As we wrote essays and poems for newsletters, sharing our theories and experiences with each other, we began adding the slogan, "The product is the process," or "The process is the product." Within a year of having set up this interactive system, we were receiving sigils every month from several hundred people. We were being asked for more and more information relating to intuitive magic, as we dubbed it. People were finding that their sigils seemed to be effective more often than any mathematical formula of randomness could explain. A desire would be created in a sigil, orgasmic fluid, etc. added, and the desire would begin to be fulfilled. The whole project exploded rapidly. It became impossible to answer all the mail, so we improvised. The more enthusiastic individuals that got in touch were told that this was an open system, a self-generating program. So access points were born, a subgroup of TOPY individuals who administered the sigils, questions, and suggestions for their region or zone. The ever-increasing cost of post and printing led to a need for funds, and so TOPY benefits were born, and TOPY merchandise, which in turn made TOPY more visible in the street culture and therefore drew in more individuals who in turn began more access points. Here's a clear difference between TOPY and the process. From the beginning, TOPY gave a great deal of its materials away for free. We absorbed the postal and packing costs. We relied on volunteers giving their time to keep on top of correspondence and organizing events, designing and manufacturing regalia, whereas the process demanded that new members give over everything they owned in a total financial commitment that in itself was a complete surrender to and thereafter dependence on the cult. During the first 2 years or so of TOPY, the impact of this constant drain on our resources was cushioned by extra income from the public face of TOPY Psychic TV. We would have a TOPY stall at the gigs selling propaganda booklets, T-shirts, silver jewelry, and so on. The salespeople were volunteers active within TOPY and would spend time answering questions and encouraging participation in TOPY to those who seemed interested. TOPY grew initially by drawing in close friends and already established collaborators. Then it spread via newsletters, essays on the sleeves of records that would include our postbox address and interviews in magazines, on the radio, and on television. In the Brighton TOPY era in the later 1980s, we looked for ways to lighten the burden on my income from Psychic TV and Temple Records by proposing more responsibility to the access points in fundraising. At one of our TOPY Global annual meetings, when access point individuals and station individuals all met for several days to discuss policy, concepts, new projects, and communities, I remember I said, whilst I realize we tend to be antagonistic to the bureaucratic, monolithic churches, we should never ignore practical ideas regardless of their source. We should look at how old-fashioned churches raise money. They have jumble sales, coffee mornings, fairs, thrift stores, etc. So let's use their methods to finance our alternative. By the next meeting, we had a market stall every Saturday and Sunday in Camden Town selling records, booklets, regalia, T-shirts, second-hand books and clothes, crafts made by TOPY individuals, and posters. One of my personal inspirations had always been Emmett Grogan and the Diggers, so we began a weekly digger stall in the park in Brighton where we would give away everything we didn't need for free. Furniture, books, clothes, tools, pottery, lamps, anything. Just like Grogan in the 1960s San Francisco altruistic hippie group The Diggers, we had a sign that said, "It's yours because it's free." Surprisingly, giving things away wasn't so easy. People waited for the catch. Some even insisted on donating money. We never got together a coffee shop cavern like the process, but we talked about it many times. I still regret we failed to emulate the process here, as it was obviously key to exposing new young people to the process in Balfour Place. We did have a second market stall in Brighton that was run by TOPY house individuals on a rota system. That was a kind of thrift store, curiosity shop. The Diggers were so absorbed into our ever-developing TOPY mythology that one TOPY individual living full-time in our Brighton house changed his name legally to Emmett Grogan P-Orridge. Another TOPY individual who was looking after our house whilst we were in Kathmandu, Nepal, financing and running a soup kitchen for Tibetan refugees, beggars, and lepers twice a day using funds donated by TOPY individuals, changed his name legally to Alice Trip to Gain, an anagram for Pierce genitalia. Poor old Alice was the courageous individual who, when the troubles hit in 1992, was caretaking the TOPY station house in Brighton, be right on, and had the intimidating misfortune to open the door to 23, yes, 23, of course, police and detectives from Scotland Yard. To Alice's credit, she remains totally loyal to TOPY ideals as she interprets them, which is another huge difference between the process and TOPY. One insisted upon blind obedience to even the most extreme vagaries of the Omega interpretations of its ever-contradictory and varying rules and theology, while TOPY insisted on personally evolved theologies and interpretation of TOPY texts, even better if they were contradictory. We decided to keep sigils anonymous by giving each individual TOPY name and number. Males were Edens and females were Collies. Strangely enough, reading Love, Sex, Fear, Death by Timothy Wiley, we noticed that these names crop up in the process, but in all honesty doubt they were chosen for that reason, as they were democratic coveted and seen as potently hierarchical, as this had been adopted as a symbol for the active relationship with synchronicity that we believe TOPY rituals engendered. Instead, we had 23 23s, making it the least special number of all. How random is random? As W.S. Burroughs would say, an individual would speak out their number, i.e., I am Eden 32 or I am Collie 19, etc. It would seem at first similar to the process renaming new members, but the first motive for Edens and Collies was the security of sigils. As they were stored at the various stations, they were vulnerable to being read for vicarious kicks. We even had 1 or 2 cases of individuals working at TOPY stations using knowledge of a sigilliger's sexual peccadillos gleaned from sneaky looks to try and seduce the individual later, using the information to seem like-minded in the erotic department. Any person found exploiting sigil information for his or her ends was immediately disconnected. The process, on the other hand, being far too often a manipulative tool for the Omega, from what we learned from the book Love, Sex, Fear, Death, seems to have used new names to imprint their power and control upon acolytes and later messengers. It is a basic technique of traditional cults to remove ties with the past by changing names, and it also solidifies the sense of belonging to a special, superior, new community that has knowledge specific to itself, that increases self-esteem, and is acquired by service to the group. TOPY was built almost as an anti-cult. We hope to avoid the traditional methods of engendering belonging by rejection of the past, so the names were used to give a sense of equality. After a year or two, we noticed that people with lower numbers were copying an attitude at TOPY gatherings, implying things like, "I was here way before you, you're eating 425 and I'm eating 10. So to prevent this, we began randomly mixing up the numbers every year or so, that no sense of superiority or specialness could even be implied. What we did eventually decide to recognize after several years' activity, however, was dedication and longevity of application to the greater good. We also found a need to come to terms with the reality that there were casually involved individuals, not much beyond consuming the events, music, and products, with only a passing interest in TOPY's deeper ambitions and aspirations. Other people regularly give time and assistance to TOPY access points and stations. Others live in TOPY houses full-time in the UK, Germany, Holland, and the USA. Beyond even that full-time dedication to TOPY as a way of life were those of us very similar in a way to the processes masters, who not only lived in TOPY houses full-time, but also made TOPY our occupation. All our work was for TOPY projects and or projects that funded TOPY directly. Sister Shadows and Brother Words ran Temple Press, publishing occultural books as we dubbed them. We strongly encourage readers of the Psychic Bible to seek out and acquire any Temple Press books, as they are all practical and or inspirational. One series of books was called Ratio 3, to signify the level of information and focus represented by its publication. Editor's note: seek out Babylon Press books. In the process, autocracy, matriarchy, and an expectation of strict obedience were imposed by Omega. There's no question that a totalitarian system can facilitate maintaining an unorthodox organization. There were times we coveted such monolithic techniques, but in the end, TOPY persevered with as democratic a system as possible. I had become disenchanted with the exploding galaxy when I discovered that whilst I was adhering absolutely to the rigorous and demanding rules of asceticism, the titular leader had created a bedroom, was spending communal money on handmade shoes for his forbidden monogamous and regular girlfriend, who was having practiced private dentistry to boot. Having pointed this out in a psychotherapeutic session, I was declared a non-person and refused food, talk, work, or any interaction until I left. Sadly, another member, nicknamed Lemon, succumbed to this cruel domination, had a nervous breakdown, becoming catatonic just before I left. So I was determined to try and avoid both the petty pitfalls of communal living and the terrors of authoritarianism, if at all possible. What we did eventually confess to ourselves was that, with the best will in the world, people connect with groups like TOPY or the process at whatever level of commitment they are ready for and prepared to accept at any given time. So we internally began to use a table of ratios to simplify day-to-day running of the ever more complex community and network. At its peak in the late 1980s, TOPY had around 10,000 individuals sigilizing and or connected worldwide with access points in Canada, England, Scotland, Holland, West Germany, USA, Italy, Australia, Sweden, and Scandinavia. So contact and purchase of the Grey Book, our basic mission statement and explanation of sigils and magic, was Ratio 1. Sending in sigils at all, even if the required 23 were not achieved, was Ratio 2. Active involvement in an access point and or completion of 23 consecutive sigils was Ratio 3. Administration of an access point or active participation in the TOPY station and or living full-time in a TOPY house was Ratio 4, and a full-time dedication to one's life and works to TOPY projects like Temple Records, Temple Press, and being full-time prime administrator of a TOPY station and or co-running TOPY Global Station in Brighton on a need-to-know basis was ratio 5. We never released this development to the general public or TOPY individuals, as we were concerned that it would create elitism and smell of hierarchies. We mainly used these demarcations to decide who got to read more sensitive memoranda and were informed of legal and media crises as our world disintegrated in a way uncaringly identical to the way the process did 20 years earlier. TOPY communal life was also a lot of fun, a game of possibilities where we took our daydreams seriously and tried to always manifest anything that seemed like a good idea as a matter of TOPY principle. During the later years of TOPY, we began to feel that just obsessing on personal self-improvement and therapy was not enough. That once we had redesigned oneself and made a magical view of the universe an intrinsic concept in one's behavior, there had to be more. As a more purely realized individual, one becomes aware of one's inclusion in the human species. An awakened reintegration as a functioning and loving part of humanity is the inevitable next level of resolution and direction as an autonomous being. I had always been drawn to Tibetan Buddhism from around 9 years old when I read 7 Years in Tibet by Heinrich Herrer while sick and off school. Later I acquired a Tibetan thigh bone trumpet, an amazing singing bowl, and other instruments that were played on Themes 1, the record that accompanied Force the Hand of Chance by Psychic TV in 1983. Continuing my search for comprehension of life, the universe, nonsensus reality, and the mystery of conscious but mortal life, I began visiting Samye Ling Tibetan Monastery with my family. Weirdly enough, or not, as the story of TOPY might suggest, the founder of Samye Ling was Chongyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was briefly connected to the process and, of course, Burroughs. Later in 1991-92, I was given the responsibility of mentoring one of the Rinpoche's son during my months in Kathmandu, Nepal, to introduce him to alternative belief systems, lifestyles, and religions. These kinds of piling up of connections can make one dizzy with possible implications. The intersections and similarities between my TOPY experience and the process seem significant in some ethereal manner. It is pointless to speculate upon them. One thing was central to TOPY, apart from all the tactics and vivid aspects, and that was beyond all else, we desperately wanted to discover and develop a system of practices that would finally enable us and like-minded individuals to consciously change our behavior, erase our negative loops, and become focused and unencumbered with psychological baggage. The process, certainly at its inception, seems to me to have had similarly high ideals. Where the two experiments diverge is the incipient hierarchy that ultimately seems to have disintegrated the process, while TOPY, though it struggled so hard to avoid having a leader or an omega, still fell foul of a surprisingly tenacious appetite in most people involved to create a leader, a guru figure who was then resented for not having all the answers. My rejection of that pressure to become the omega figurehead and other individuals' accusations that we had become hierarchical caused a splintering and an amount of jealousy that we never really resolved before the whole thing became too draining and monolithic, leading TOPY station in Brighton to declare on an enigmatic postcard sent to everyone on our mailing list, "Change priorities ahead." Thus concludes my reading of section 121 of the Psychic Bible, part B of part 13, The Process is the Product. Tomorrow I will finish up part 13, The Process is the Product, with part C and section 122. See you then.